and give the Saudis enough time. There's no need to panic at the moment. What we have seen in the markets today is an initial reaction by the trading community. But going forward, I think the updates that will be coming from Saudi Arabia will further calm the markets.
That was OPEC Secretary General Mohammed Barkindo speaking in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg Television. Welcome now, Joseph Minarik. He's Conference Board Chief Policy Economist and former Chief Economist at the OMB. He comes to us from Washington. So, Mr. Minarik, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with basically the oil situation. As an economist, what effects might you anticipate for the U.S. economy, the global economy, from this oil crisis, I think it's fair to say at the moment?
We're still, of course, looking to find out how long this interruption is going to last. Some people say that there are different opinions, and we're going to have to see where that goes. How many weeks? Who can come up with additional supply? Folks are looking at the United States. We probably can't gear up fast enough for the kind of hit that the market has taken at this point. So prices are going to go up. That is going to affect the U.S. consumer. There's a lot of diversity in terms of who spends a lot of money on gasoline. It's mostly the wide open spaces, not the urban centers on the West Coast and the East Coast. For those who are in that position of putting a big portion of their budgets in gasoline, this is going to be a hit. They are going to be affected. It will probably have a perceptible effect on consumer spending.
Of course, Joseph, we have the Fed meeting later this week, and one question for all of us is, to what extent, if any, will the Fed take this into account as they make a decision? And unless we might miss the connection, President Trump is best to draw it today. He tweeted out the United States, because the Federal Reserve is paying a much higher interest rate than other competing countries, they can't believe how lucky they are that Jay Powell and the Fed don't have a clue. And now, on top of it all the oil hit, big interest rate drop, stimulus, exclamation point. Is it likely the Fed will look at this and say, I don't want to take into account at all, that in fact we should cut rates because it's going to put pressure on the economy, or could they increase rates because it could increase inflation?
The Fed will certainly look at it. Of course, the oil price increase cuts both ways. On the one hand, it will probably weaken the economy, and the Fed is concerned about downside risks. On the other hand, we've been talking about how inflation has been low, and that was part of the motivation for the Fed to try to juice the economy right now. This is going to increase inflation. Over the last 6 months, the headline inflation number has been low, but that has been held down by low oil prices and low food prices. And now, lo and behold, we're getting a kick in the oil prices. So the Fed is going to have to, they are already in a posture of cutting rates. I think the markets expect them. It's going to be difficult for the Fed to change the mindset of the markets, and they don't like to surprise the markets. So I would expect the Fed to go ahead with another rate cut. It will be a quarter point. It won't be anything of the size that, some people are talking about. But at the same time, as we're looking down the road, the possibility that we could knock inflation somewhat off of its moorings is there. And an increase in oil prices is not going to help on that front.
How differently is the United States positioned today than, for example, back in the 70s? Because as you referred to, we have all of this shale production coming on board. The president actually tweeted out in a separate tweet, we got plenty of oil because of shale, presumably. How much can that really limit the effect of this oil shock?
We are certainly better off, there's no question. Among the oil resources we have the strategic reserve. The strategic reserve is mostly heavy oil. It's not universally useful. It has to go to particular refineries. So it's not an immediate response of great power, but it's there. We certainly have the option of using more of our oil domestically, but of course, if global prices are rising, that's going to be a magnet for some U.S. oil, which will seek the highest return. So are we in a better position? Absolutely. Compared to the 1970s, there's really no comparison. But there are limits because oil is fungible, and when prices go up in one place, they go up elsewhere as well.
Well, let's take a big step back and talk about the state of the U.S. economy generally, because you were chief economist at the OMB. There are various dings, if I could put it that way, in the economy. We have the U.S.-China trade policy uncertainty that Chair Powell has referred to more than once. Now we have this oil shock. There are various things that give us some pause, create some anxiety in the marketplace. But how is the economy doing despite all that?
The economy is hanging on very well. We're in a very mature expansion. If you look around for immediate sources of concern, you can't really find any. But there are these nagging weaknesses. There's the trade war. Now, the trade war is a self-inflicted wound. We have decided to be extremely aggressive with respect to China, and in past months, even our allies in Canada and Europe and Mexico. So to the extent that we have trade policy putting a constraint on the economy, and we have monetary policy trying to make it grow faster, in effect, we've created an internal reaction loop. And you have to ask the question of how long we can go in that direction. In the longer term, the reality that we all have to face is the retirement of the baby boom generation. We baby boomers are looking for exits from the labor force, and as that happens, potential U.S. growth slows, and that is going to be a major constraint on U.S. output going forward. The notion that all we have to do to grow more rapidly is to repeat what we did in the 1950s and the 1960s just isn't true, because at that time we had a rapidly growing labor force, and now we have much slower growth in our workforce. Right. So we're subject to that constraint, and that's an issue. Okay, thank you so much, Joseph. Really good to have you with us today. That's Joseph Minarik. He's Chief Policy Economist at the Conference Board in Washington.